So we rendered content conditionally and we successfully lifted our state up. And of course for that we had to dive into some new patterns. We had to add a new method here with initState. But I hope it's clear how all these things work together and why the app now works the way it does work. Before we now continue and we, for example, work on the actual questions screen, I want to show you an alternative way of rendering our different screens here conditionally. Currently, we're making sure that different screens are rendered by storing different screens in this active screen variable. This works and you can use this, but this also requires us to add this initState method here, for example, to set active screen to the proper widget. We needed to use initState because we needed to reference switch screen here when storing that initial value in active screen, and this was not possible when initializing it up here, as you learned. That's why it's also worth looking at another solution which will actually allow us to get rid of initState. Instead of storing the active screen in a variable, we could also store some identifier for a screen in here. We could still call the variable active screen, but now instead of storing the widget, we could store a string. For example, start screen as an identifier for the start screen, though this really is up to you. It could be any string identifier. It could even be a number. Every screen could be mapped to a number. But here I'll map screens to strings, since this is a bit more human readable, I'd say. And then in switch screen, we could therefore replace active screen not with a widget, but with another string, which here could be questions-screen. Again, this identifier is also up to you, but both are strings now. Now, what's the advantage of using strings? The advantage is that here we can, of course, initialize active screen to a string. And now we can infer the actual widgets that should be rendered based on these string values. And for that, we can go to the build method, where we need the actual widget that should be output. And down here, as a value for child, we can now use a so-called ternary expression. A ternary expression, in Dart and in many other programming languages as well, is a feature, a concept, which allows you to check a condition and then yield one value if the condition is met and an alternative value if it's not met. And it's written like this. You first define your condition. For example here, that active screen is equal to start screen. And that would be written like this. Active screen equals, with two equal signs, that's important, start screen. Now it's two equal signs instead of one, because here we actually don't want to assign a new value to active screen. That is what you would do with one equal sign. And here would be the wrong place for that, because here a value is wanted, a widget value is wanted, not some assignment operation. And therefore we use two equal signs, because two equal signs are a totally different thing in Dart, and again in many other programming languages as well. Because this is now a comparison operator that checks for equality. This operator will yield true as a value for this overall code if active screen is equal to start screen, and otherwise it yields false. And maybe you remember this slide from the previous course section where I did mention these Boolean values already. It's a special kind of value which is supported by Dart and basically all other programming languages out there in the world, which is either true or false. And this bool type exists almost entirely just for the single reason that often in your code you need to compare values and you must find out whether a certain condition is met, true, or not met, false. So here this code will yield true if active screen currently holds start screen written like this as a string value, and false otherwise. And here, to then turn this into a ternary expression and use this information, whether this is true or false, you then add a question mark, and after this question mark, you then define the value that should be yielded by the overall ternary expression, and that should therefore be used as a value for child if this is true. And here, that would then be the start screen widget, which is created like this, and to which we still pass a pointer to the switch screen method. So just as we used it before somewhere else, now here in the build method, derived conditionally based on this condition. But at the moment in this condition, we only have one value that we use if this condition is met. We also must define the value that should be used if it's not met. And you do that by adding a colon thereafter, and now you define the else case, the value that should be used if this condition yields false, if it's not met. And that value here, in this case, would be my questions screen widget, which can be turned into a const value. Now I formatted the code, and this is now how the overall ternary expression looks like. We have a condition with the double equals an operator, which yields true or false, and then we have a value that's yielded if this is true, and we have a value that's yielded if this condition is false, so if it's not met. And whichever value is yielded here, so start screen or question screen, is then the value that's passed to this child argument. With that, if you save that and force your app to reload, you should still see that start screen here initially, and when you click this button, it should still switch to the questions screen. So this also works, and that's a different approach for rendering content conditionally. It's up to you which approach you prefer, but this approach has the advantage that it requires a bit less code. Most importantly, it does not require this extra initState function. And I'm showing these different approaches because in different situations you might need different solutions, and of course you also simply might prefer different solutions. Now here I'll stick to this identifier solution, but I want to show you yet another alternative to this ternary expression here.